Welcome to my Bake Escape. This week I am sharing a recipe that uses apples, the other fall fruit. This is my recipe for an apple fritter bread. This bread is moist and packed full of apple and cinnamon flavor. I use fresh apple cider in the glaze, which just takes it to another level. For the full recipe, be sure to visit mybakeescape.com and follow me on Instagram and Pinterest at mybakeescape. If you have already subscribed to my channel, welcome back and thank you for the support. If you haven't subscribed yet, be sure to hit that subscribe button and check out my fall recipe playlist for lots of delicious fall recipes. This recipe was inspired by an apple fritter I recently had while stopping at Apple Hill. Apple Hill is in Dorado County, and during the fall months, a lot of farms open up and allow visitors to pick apples from their trees, go on hay rides, enjoy lots of fun activities that are great for the whole family, and most importantly, offer delicious fall treats. One of my favorite places to stop in at is Able Acres. I have visited Able Acres several times over the last 10 or so years, and I just love the variety of treats they offer. They have apple cider donuts, apple fritters, fresh baked pies, apple butter, candy and caramel apples, and lots more. They also have fresh apple cider. This time I ordered an apple fritter, an apple cider donut, and I picked up half a gallon of their fresh apple cider. My all-time favorite donut is the apple fritter, and I actually have made them, and I have a recipe on my channel. I linked that video in the description of this video if you would like to watch it. The apple fritter was packed full of chunks of apple and cinnamon flavor. It was so delicious, and so was the apple cider donut. Let me know in the comments if you would like me to make a video sharing a recipe for these delicious apple cider donuts. Now on to the recipe. For this recipe, you will need a few ingredients, and there are a couple of steps, but it is pretty simple to make and it comes together pretty quickly. The first step is to brown butter. I really feel that browning butter adds another level of flavor and deliciousness to this recipe. This is optional. You don't have to brown the butter, but if you do want to make it the way I made it, I do recommend that you brown butter. So I have 1.5 sticks of unsalted butter that I'm going to brown. To brown butter, you just pretty much melt it in a pan. You want to make sure that the pan is big enough because as this butter starts to cook and melt, it will bubble up and you don't want it to overflow or burn you. So just be very careful. I also recommend that you have everything ready. So whatever you need to transfer the butter into needs to be right there ready to go, and it has to be heat proof or high temperature safe because the butter is going to be really hot, and once it starts to brown, you don't have a lot of time. You will need to remove it from the heat and transfer it right away because it can burn very quickly. So you want to go ahead and melt down the butter at like a medium high heat for a while. Just keep an eye on it, keep stirring it. You'll notice that it will bubble up kind of ferociously, and just keep stirring it, and you will start to smell a nutty aroma and start to see brown bits form like here. That's when you need to remove it from the heat and then carefully transfer it to your bowl. And then you need to let this come to room temperature. So it could sit on the counter for about 15 to 20 minutes. You just want to make sure that it is cool enough to add to your recipe. While the brown butter is cooling, I went ahead and prepped the apples. I picked up these sugar beet apples at Trader Joe's. I was looking for Granny Smith, but they didn't have any in stock, so I decided to give these a try. So I'm using 2 apples here. I washed them and dried them, and I used a vegetable peeler to remove the skin. I am kind of a competitive person. Anytime I peel apples or potatoes or pears, I always try to do it in one strand, and I almost got it on the first one, but the second one I did come very close to peeling the entire apple with just one strand. This recipe calls for 2.5 cups of chopped apples. These apples were fairly large, and I felt that two of them would be enough. It just depends on the size of the apples. You might need 3, so just be sure to consider that when deciding how many apples you're going to need for this recipe. So once I peeled the apples, I went ahead and chopped them into bite-sized pieces. So I'm using a 2.5 cup measuring cup, and I went ahead and placed that 1 apple in there. That one apple gave me 2 cups. So I didn't even need that much more. So I just cut a slice from the second apple, and that gave me exactly maybe a little over 2.5 cups of apples. You just kind of have to eyeball it. Once the apples are prepped, I went ahead and covered them with plastic wrap to minimize the oxidation that happens. And as you can see here, the brown butter has cooled slightly. It started to solidify a little bit, and I can go ahead and move on with the rest of the recipe. For the bread, you will need brown butter, all-purpose flour, granulated sugar, milk, 2 eggs, baking powder, salt, and vanilla extract. So I start by combining the dry ingredients. So to the flour, I add the baking powder, followed by the salt. For those of you who followed me for a while, you've probably realized that I do add salt to various components of my recipes. I do this because salt brings out the flavors in recipes, especially sweet ones, and it helps balance that sweetness in recipes as well. I mix in the salt and set the dry ingredients aside while I work on the wet ingredients. For the wet ingredients, to the brown butter, I add the granulated sugar. You can do this in the bowl of a stand mixer, but I used a hand mixer, and I went ahead and creamed that brown butter and the granulated sugar together until the sugar has dissolved and you can see all of those brown bits from the butter. Then I added the eggs. And mix those in. Added the vanilla extract, mix that in. Now it's time to incorporate the dry ingredients, so I went ahead and added that flour mixture, and with the hand mixer on low, I started to mix until it was incorporated, and then I turned the mixer to medium, continued to mix until everything was mixed in. Then I added the milk and then just mixed until the milk was mixed in. And at this stage, I went ahead and preheated my oven to 350 degrees Fahrenheit. That is 176 degrees Celsius. And I prepped the apples. So to the apples, I added brown sugar, cinnamon, and a little bit of salt. Then I just mixed to make sure that all of those apple chunks are coated in that sugar cinnamon mixture. The last component for this is the brown sugar and cinnamon topping. So to the brown sugar, I went ahead and added cinnamon, and in a small bowl, I mixed those together. I have all the components to this bread ready. I am using a 9x5 loaf pan. And to prepare this, I spray it with nonstick cooking spray, and I also decided to use a parchment paper sling. The bread will have a lot of moisture from the apples and will be very tender and moist, and so using a parchment sling to help me release it from the pan is probably the best bet to avoid the bread from cracking or the topping from falling off if I were to turn it out onto a cooling rack. So I went ahead and cut down a piece of parchment paper so that it would fit inside of the loaf pan. And to make a sling, you need 2 pieces, one going one way and the other going the other direction, and it kind of creates a basket that you can pull the bread out in. So I went ahead and I sprayed the pan with nonstick cooking spray. Then I placed one piece of that parchment inside, sprayed it with more spray, and then I laid the other parchment paper across the other way so that it creates like this basket that will help remove that cake from the pan once it's baked. Then I went ahead and sprayed that top part again, making sure I got all the sides. So the oven is preheated, my loaf pan is ready. It is time to assemble this loaf. So I went ahead and took half of the batter and I poured it into the loaf pan. And then using this rubber spatula, I spread that along the bottom of the pan as evenly as I could. Then I took the apples and I placed half of these apples on top of that first layer of the batter. and I made sure to evenly spread the apple. And then I added the remaining batter to the top of those apples, and I spread that out evenly. And then added the rest of the apples to top that, and I went ahead and used my very clean hands to evenly distribute the apples all along the top. I just want to make sure that this loaf bakes evenly and that every bite has that delicious apple flavor. And then the last step is to top this whole thing with that brown sugar cinnamon topping and make sure it's evenly distributed. And this is going to caramelize with the juices from the apples. And this is what's going to give this loaf that apple fritter taste. So as you notice, these little wings, the parchment paper wings, will kind of come out while baking. So I used a little bit of the dough to stick them to the sides, and that will make sure they stay down while baking in the oven. And I went ahead and baked this for about 55 minutes. I checked it with 3 minutes left and it was still not set in the middle, so I kept baking it. And then about another 8 minutes passed and I checked it again and it was ready to come out. And this is what it looks like. So I didn't have a toothpick or a bamboo skewer, but I do have these big skewers. So I used that. You just need something that's thin that can poke through and come out. And you want it to come out semi-clean. Like it had a couple of crumbs and that's okay. You just don't want globs of batter because that means it's not ready. So I went ahead and let this cool for about 15 minutes and then I carefully removed it using that parchment sling. And look at how clean it came out. While the loaf is cooling, I went ahead and made that glaze. So I did use that fresh apple cider that I picked up from Apple Acres. And I also am using powdered sugar and a little bit of salt. So to the powdered sugar, I added the salt. Give that a mix, and then I added that apple cider. And I mixed that together. Depending on the consistency you want, you might have to add a little bit more powdered sugar, or if you want it a little bit thinner, you can add a little bit more apple cider. I actually feel that I added a little too much apple cider. It was a little thin for my preference, so I added a couple of tablespoons of powdered sugar and mixed that in until I achieved the consistency that I wanted, which was kind of like a thick drizzle. Now you want to be sure the bread is completely cool before you add the icing, or else it will just melt right off. So the bread did sit out for about an hour, so it was nice and cool. I went ahead and removed that parchment paper from underneath, and then I just started drizzling this delicious apple cider glaze on top. Look at how delicious that looks, and it smells incredible. So once the glaze is on the bread, let it set for about 30 minutes or so, and then you can cut a slice. I was a little anxious. I didn't wait 30 minutes. I went ahead and cut a slice, and look at how delicious that looks. You can see the chunks of apples inside of the bread with some of that cinnamon, and that top, the apples caramelized with that cinnamon and brown sugar. And let me tell you, this smells incredible, and when I tasted it, it did remind me of an apple fritter. So I really was happy with the recipe and how this turned out. I hope you try this recipe. If you do, let me know in the comments if you have any questions. If you liked it as much as I did, I'd love to hear from you. And remember, be sure to visit mybakeescape.com for the full recipe. Thanks for watching and have a sweet day.